G'day, Starlo here, and welcome to episode 6 of my Tuesday chat videos and podcasts, brought to you as always by CM Partners Accounting. Listen, if you've already got an accountant and they tend to overpromise and underdeliver, or they're just difficult to get hold of or deal with, you seriously need to give CM Partners a go. They're very, very good at what they do. And if you use the Starlo link down below, and tell them that Starlo sent you, they'll give you a free, no obligations consultation to talk about your accounting needs. Okay, let's dive into this week's episode, and I want to talk boats and boating this week, and I'm talking about boats of all sizes, from tiny little float tubes and stand-up paddleboards and kayaks, up to floating gin palaces and liveaboard motherships. And across the last 60 years, I've been on all of them, and I've developed some opinions about boats and boating, the good, the bad, and the ugly. My very first bit of floating fishing transportation was actually a rather nondescript little fiberglass green Canadian kayak. I can't remember if my father found it at a garage sale or a council clean-up, where someone had put it out to be taken away, but it had a couple of holes in it. We patched that little green fiberglass canoe up to the point where it mostly kept the water on the outside, and it served me really well for the next few years. I had some great adventures in it, including a couple of multi-day trips down the Shoalhaven River from Tallowa Dam to Nowra, chasing bass and camping on the riverbank. But there's one of those trips in particular that I'll never forget. It started raining almost as soon as I was dropped off up near Tallowa Dam, and it just got heavier and heavier. And through the night, the rain was absolutely torrential. I ended up sleeping underneath the upturned canoe. That was the only way I could keep the rain off myself. The drawback with that was that every crawling, slithering, jumping critter on the little island that I was on tried to get under the canoe with me. It still makes my skin crawl to think about it, and I didn't get much sleep. But by the time I got up in the morning, the river had risen several metres, the island that I was on had reduced in size by about half, and the river was a raging torrent of brown, muddy water with branches and entire tree trunks going past, even the occasional dead cow. It was fully in flood, and it was a pretty serious flood at that. I knew the fishing was a write-off, so I just climbed into the canoe and started heading for Nowra, and I was heading at a fair old pace going with that flood water. I was about 14 at the time, and naturally enough, my parents were worried sick, and they'd notified the authorities that I was basically missing on the river, along with several other people, and the nearby Navy base of Albatross had a couple of helicopters up looking for people on the river. But every time one went over, I'd paddle in underneath the trees. I had a fair idea they might be looking for me as well as other people, and I was so embarrassed and nervous about being found that I went and hid each time they came over. Apart from anything else, I figured that if they did find me and winch me out, they'd leave my little green canoe down there, and that'd be the last I'd ever see of it. Maybe not the smartest decision, but like I said, I was about 14 at the time. We don't always make our smartest decisions at that age. I made it safely to Nowra, and the river was so high that I paddled straight in across the boat ramp and the jetty and the road at the sailing club, pulled my canoe up onto the dry bank, and walked to the closest public phone to ring my parents and tell them that I was still alive. It was quite a trip. I can't remember what happened to that little canoe, but eventually I outgrew it. I think we either gave it to someone else or we ended up putting it out for a council clean-up. And for the next couple of years, I was basically land-based fishing. I used to fish the rocks and wade the estuaries and occasionally score a trip out with a friend in a boat. But I didn't actively get back into boating until I got my first serious job in fishing as the assistant editor of Fishing World magazine, working under Ron Calcutt at the beginning of the 1980s. As passionate as Ron was about his fishing, he was perhaps even more passionate about his boating, and he really knew his stuff when it came to boating. I learnt so much from working alongside him, not just about journalism and fishing and boating, but life in general. He was a great mentor. The old cool cat, as we used to call him, had some fairly fixed ideas about boats. He knew what he liked and he knew what he didn't like. I remember a couple of the things that he absolutely hated were tinted windscreens on boats. He just said that it made it too hard to see and that was dangerous. And he also hated those little quarter seats down in the back corner of so many boats, even the ones that fold away. He just thought they got in the way of fishing. And of course, fishing was his major motivation for boating. And everything that he thought about boats was about how well they were suited to the kinds of fishing that he liked doing, which included things like jigging for kingfish, trolling for game fish, and fishing lightly weighted floaters for snapper and trag and things like that. So what he did love was centre consoles and hulls that had a bit of flare and V up the front, but then flattened out in the rear end to give them good stability at rest. Good fishing platforms. I think I picked up a lot of his habits because a lot of the things that Ron liked and didn't like about boats are exactly the same things that I like and don't like about boats these days. While I was with him, Ron variously ran Steebers, Quintrexes and one of the old Markham whalers, a little twin-hulled fiberglass boat. And I fished with him and travelled with him in all of those. We had some great trips together and some funny experiences. It was very much a student-pupil relationship, and I used to get a bit nervous about doing the wrong thing, and I was always trying to impress Ron. And I remember one day in particular, early morning, and we were on the far north coast of New South Wales about to do a beach launch. I can't remember if it was Mini Waters or Sandon River, but it was somewhere in that stretch of coast, beautiful stretch of coastline. We were going to do a beach launch. There was no ramp where we were, so Ron was going to back the Quinny down across the beach with me ducked down under the flared bow of the Quinny, keeping up with him, and at the right point he'd shout, hit the brakes, and I'd throw my shoulder into the boat and heave it off the trailer. Well, halfway across the beach, Ron suddenly decided to stop and make sure I had the instructions straight. So he hit the anchor, stuck his head out the window and called something out, and I assumed it was the go signal. So the shoulder went under the boat, I pushed it off the trailer onto the dry sand, about 30 metres from the closest water. Oops. As it turned out, it wouldn't be my last dry land launch either, but that's another story for another time. Ron was way ahead of his time in some of his attitudes towards boating too. I remember him telling me as early as 1981 that four-stroke outboards were going to be the way of the future, and they were as rare as hen's teeth in those days. I think Yamaha had just started to make a few. He turned out to be spot on. He knew his stuff, that's for sure. So, although I got to spend a lot of time in different boats through the 1980s, I didn't actually own my own boat until early in the 90s, when I came back from that year of living in Canada that I talked about earlier in this series. Even when I first moved back, I didn't have a boat. I was living down in Gerringong and I fished with a lot of the gun local anglers down there. We used to do beach launches off the beach at Giroa and fish the bommies and famous inshore spots around there, and also chase pelagics, tuna and so on further out of quite small tinnies, mostly old Quinnies with old Johnsons and Evinrudes on the back. It was real seat-of-your pants boating and it taught me a heck of a lot. Eventually though, I knew I wanted my own boat and I got into my first one with the help of Ronnie Webster from Twin Fisher boats, which were made in Orange in central New South Wales. They're a twin-hulled alloy boat and one of the only catamaran hulls that works really well with a single outboard. I had a 4-metre one to begin with, but with Ronnie Webster's help I soon upgraded to a 4.3. I dread to think how many hundreds, maybe thousands of hours I spent fishing out of those Websters. I competed in tournaments from them and I did heaps of social fishing and lots of gathering of content for magazine articles and so forth. They were terrific little vessels, very seaworthy, very stable to fish out of. I guess if I had any minor criticisms of the Twin Fishers, it was the fact that their high flat sides did tend to catch the wind a little bit and make them quite susceptible to the breeze. And also at certain angles, when you were fishing, the chop would go up into the tunnel between the two hulls and slap really noisily against the aluminium. I was getting right into my stealthy finesse fishing at the time, and that'd annoy me, but I could usually angle the boat using the bow-mounted electric to reduce that noise. But you know, I was already coming around to think that I found fiberglass hulls more appealing than alloy ones. Their softer ride, their quieter presence on the water, and just the fact that they were smooth surfaces inside instead instead of sharp angles that you were forever kicking your toe against or falling up against as you do in a tinny. And in one of those sliding doors moments that changes the whole direction of our lives, I was walking out of the Sydney Boat Show one cool, blustery August afternoon, headed for one of the bars at Darling Harbour and a nice cold beer, when the then girlfriend of a bloke called Tyson Dethridge grabbed me by the arm and wheeled me around to meet Tyson and see the boats that he built, the full bore range. These were very much an Australianised version of the American bass boats that were just starting to come into the country at the time, thanks to the impetus provided by the ABT and AFC tournament circuits. Anyway, Tyson was really keen to get me into one of his full bores, and it happened. I ended up with a 5 metre one and then later a 5.5 metre, ran them for several years, fished a lot of tournaments out of them, trailed them from Victoria up to central Queensland, fishing in all kinds of waters for all manner of fish, and I absolutely loved the full bores. I ran 4-stroke 115 yammies on the back of them, and they really got up and travelled, I tell you. They had a lot in common with those American bass boats, but they didn't seem to be quite as much of a one-trick pony as those earlier bass boats were. They had a little bit more versatility and a bit more capability, in my opinion anyway, and fantastic platforms to fish out of. Massive casting decks at the front and rear, and as stable as a jetty when you pulled up. So good. They had a lot of what I call fishability. I was firmly hooked on fiberglass by now, and I was starting to really admire some of those bass boats, but even more so the flat skiffs and the bay boats that were being fully imported from America at the time. So when Tyson eventually wrapped up the full bore business, and I had to give mine back, I looked around for something else, and I ended up in a fully imported American-made Scout 170, a bit of a crossover between a flat skiff and a bay boat. It was their Stew-Apt signature series, and for those of you who don't know, Stew-Apt is a really famous and renowned American saltwater fly fisher, and you could see his input into some of the design in this boat. It was very schmick. The Americans really do it well. Every hatch closes snugly and seals waterproof. Every bit of trim and every fitting is neat and tidy and works exactly as it was intended to. Very classy. I didn't have the Scout for all that long, but I really enjoyed using it. Although I must say, it was a fairly wet boat in any sort of quartering sea. You didn't have anywhere to hide. The same can be said of most of these open boat designs. They go well going straight into it, but if you've got a quarter or run across that sea, you better have some pretty good wet weather gear. Well, Tyson hadn't gotten out of boat building completely, and in fact he developed a new range of boats called cross country. These were a foam core sandwich design with fiberglass either side of a lightweight foam core. An immensely strong but light way of building boat hulls. It's also the way they build nose cones on things like jumbo jets, so you know it's got to be pretty strong. I remember going to a testing facility with Tyson early in the piece, and they were dropping heavy metal weights from a fair height onto different materials, aluminium, standard fiberglass, and the foam core sandwich. And the foam core sandwich came through it by far the best. It'd deflect and bounce the weight off, and all it did was crack the outside layer of fiberglass, which you could then repair. It'd punch straight through aluminium and straight through solid fiberglass. It sold me. So I ended up in one of his little ones, 4.1, 4.2 metres, I forget, I think it's 4.1. Great little open runabout with a tiller steer motor on it. It was just a lot of fun, and I was really enjoying my estuary and freshwater fishing out of that little cross country when I met my soon-to-be wife, Jo, up in Darwin, and decided to move to Darwin for a couple of years to live up there. Well, Jo took one look at that little cross country and said, "I'm not fishing in crocodile-infested waters out of that thing." And she had a point. The sides were a bit low. And thus began a new project, working with Tyson on the development of a larger cross-country, a centre console that would run a 70 horsepower Yami. We initially called that a 475, but when we measured it more accurately, it was more like 5 metres. We named the prototype Evil Minnow, and I'll never forget it arriving in Darwin with Tyson for its test runs on the harbour and out to sea. It was a really, really impressive little rig, incredibly light and responsive, but also strong and quite capable of handling some nasty chop, which is pretty common up in that part of the world. That vessel became our top-end boat, and we gave it an absolute flogging, including towing it all the way to Maningrida up in Arnhem Land over hundreds of kilometres of deeply rutted dirt roads. We ended up breaking the trailer, but we couldn't do anything more than cosmetic damage to that hull. Foam core sandwich is impressively tough. I think that boat ultimately helped to change the way a lot of Territorians thought about boating. Up until that point, unless you ran a plate alloy tinny and fished exclusively with bait casters, you simply weren't territory tough. Even Darwin's popular ABC radio fishing program was called Tales from the Tinny. But these days you'll find plenty of fiberglass hulls and spin reels on rivers like the mighty Daly. Things have indeed changed. Evil Minnow got us onto some great fishing, and it also got us out of some very sticky situations, including scary run-off deluges, crocodile attacks, and one that'll always burn in my memory banks when we were out at 4 Mile Hole in Kakadu one day with Brett Wilson, who worked for Shimano at the time. We were fishing the build-up, which is that hot, sticky period when thunderstorms develop every afternoon, but often it doesn't rain. We were catching barramundi and Saratoga, having a great day, but it was stinking hot on the water, and there were these massive thunderheads on the horizon. All three of us, myself, Joe and Brett, were quietly hoping that it would actually rain and cool things down. Well, you know what they say, you need to be careful what you wish for, because the heavens opened and it bucketed down. And when we got back to the launching site, there's no ramp there, you just launch straight over the earth bank. Everything had turned to mud, and it was greasy and slippery, and there was no way that my Hilux was going to get that boat out of the water. Every time we put the boat on the trailer and tried to bring it up the bank, despite the light weight of the hull, everything just spun and we just were not going to get out of there. It was still pouring with rain, darkness was falling, there were crocodiles swimming around, the mosquitoes were coming out in clouds, and I had a brainwave. We pushed the boat off the trailer. I was able to just get the empty trailer back up on top of the bank, and we ran the anchor chain from the back of the trailer to the winch eyelet on the front of the cross country. And I then just drove forward slowly across the floodplain, and we pulled Evil Minnow up over the mud bank and onto the grass. Then we undid the chain, winched it on, and we were on our way before total darkness set in. I don't think we'd have been able to do that with a heavier rig. We brought the cross country with us when we moved back down south and used it for several more years until Tyson eventually sold the cross country business, and the boat, which had only ever been on long-term loan, went with it. So we found ourselves looking for another rig. And serendipitously, I'd just recently had a run with Mark Bargy Bargainquest, a great fishing guide who was Harvey Bay based at the time, and he was operating a 5-metre Beastmaster Snubby, an Australian-made fiberglass boat made by a bloke called Robbie Ferguson up in Queensland. I fell in love with it and knew that was what I wanted. Well, Robbie's boats are absolutely bespoke. They're built one at a time, and no two are exactly alike. Ordering one off him is a bit like ordering a suit from a premium tailor. Everything has to get measured up, and there's lots of back and forth between the customer and the builder. It took quite a long time for Robbie to finish that boat, but it was an exciting day when we picked it up, and I knew from the very first run that we had a pretty special rig. Many people were a bit surprised that we went for tiller steer over another centre console, but there were some pragmatic reasons for that decision. Lower cost and quicker delivery time were paramount, but also I really liked the idea of having all that space in the boat to use. I've had absolutely no regrets, but to be honest with you, Joe does find that 70 horsepower tiller steer fairly heavy and hard on her arm and shoulder. We're into our 8th year now with the Beastmaster, and we don't see any reason to make a change. I'd often said that if I did go to another boat, it'd probably be to a smaller, lighter rig when I get a bit older, just to make it easier to handle. But for now, the Snubby is just perfect. It does everything we ask from it. Look, I'd love it to draw 10 centimetres less water up on the flats, and I dare say Joe would love a centre console and hydraulic steering. But apart from those minor criticisms, it ticks a lot of boxes for us. And we both have native watercraft kayaks for when we need something smaller to get into tighter water. Best of both worlds. It's a cliche, but also a truism, that all boats are a compromise. In some regards, they just don't make them big enough for me, especially out on rough, open water. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, I can never get them quite small enough to get into those tight corners and shallow areas that I love to fish. It's a constant balancing act. My advice to you, if you're shopping for a boat at the moment, is to take your time and really think about what you need. Sit down and make yourself an itemised list of what you want and what you need in a boat. Above all else, be absolutely honest with yourself about what it is that you most want to do with the boat. Don't end up with a bow rider with an awkward canopy just because the kids might come out 2 or 3 times a year with you and go for a water ski behind the boat. It'll probably not happen, and you'll suffer for the 50 times a year when you do go out there fishing. Buy the boat for the things that it's going to do most. If you spend 90% of your time fishing in estuaries and freshwater environments and only go offshore half a dozen times a year, buy yourself a boat that works best in those enclosed and semi-enclosed systems. Because if you buy one that works best for the 10% of the fishing that you're going to do, it'll be a compromise and it won't be perfect for the stuff that you mostly do. And realise that you might need 2 vessels. If you've got a biggish boat, you might also need a canoe or a kayak, or a car topper or a little punt, or a tinny that you can just throw in from the bank for small water work. Consider having 2 options. A couple of other tips I'd give you is to spend more than you think you need to on the trailer. People too often forget about the trailer. Your boat is going to do a lot more kilometres on that trailer than it's ever going to do on the water, and it stands the chance of being damaged a lot more from a poor trailer than from rough water. Also, err on the larger side for your outboard motor. If you think you need a 60, go for a 70. If you think you need a 70, go for a 90. Trust me, a bigger motor running at 70 or 80% capacity is going to last a lot longer and wear a lot more slowly than a small motor that's being flogged and going flat out all the time. The other thing is budget for some good accessories. You'll need a decent depth sounder, and you may need a bow-mounted electric motor if you're into that style of fishing. They'll make a huge difference to your fishing life, so factor them into your budget. Boating's not cheap. Boats have been disparagingly referred to as a hole in the water into which you pour money. And it can be true. There's always something that needs to be done, or something that you want to add to your boat, or a bigger and better boat that you want to upgrade to. And let's face it, money's tight for all of us these days, which, by the way, is why it's important to have a good accountant like CM Partners, the sponsors of this program. Honestly, give them a call. They'll help make sure you've got more money in your pocket at the end of the tax year to spend on good things like fishing and boating. It's worked for me anyway. That's about it for this week. I really look forward to catching up with you for next Tuesday's chat. And until then, tight lines and happy, safe boating. Cheers for now.